The letter in her hand felt warm with promise, but the wind howling outside the train window spoke only of the brutal Wyoming winter ahead. Clara Mae Jenkins, a seamstress from Illinois with more hope than fortune, was on her way to marry a man she had never met. He had promised a home and a future. But out on the high plains, where the sky is vast and the winters are unforgiving, promises can be as brittle as ice. And Clara was about to discover what happens when a heart full of hope meets a wall of cold silence. The porcelain teacups from her mother went first, wrapped in newspaper and sold for a pittance. Then went the rocking chair, its worn arms holding the ghosts of lullabies she'd never sing. With each transaction, Clara Mayhew felt a piece of her old life in Illinois fall away, making room for a future she could only see in the script of a stranger's letters. The letters had come from a place called Dry Creek, Wyoming, penned by a cattleman named Jedediah Kane. His words were plain and direct, speaking not of romance, but of partnership against the long winters. He wrote of needing a woman to share his fire and help build a legacy on the high plains. Crucially, he never wrote of a woman's face or figure, and in that silence, Clara found hope. She was a woman of sturdy frame and capable hands, more like a deep-rooted cottonwood than a delicate prairie rose. In his practical words, she read an acceptance of a woman built for endurance, not for show. Perhaps, she thought, the steady heart and generous spirit she possessed would be more than enough. And so, the selling continued until all that remained were the essentials. Into one large steamer trunk, she folded the sum of her past, a well-worn family Bible, her trusty sewing kit, and the heavy quilt stitched with the memories of generations, with a one-way ticket in her glove, and a spirit brimming with unspoken hope. Clara stepped onto the westbound train. She was leaving everything behind, armed with little more than a stranger's pledge and a destination deep in the heart of winter. The groan of steel on steel faded into the distance, and the train that had carried her across a continent became a ghost disappearing into the white haze. Clara stood solitary on the raw timber of the platform, a sudden stillness descending. As the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the world in a soft, cold silence, she drew her shawl closer, a fragile shield against the immense, indifferent landscape, and waited. The minutes stretched, each one colder than the last. A stockman on a tired-looking gelding gave her a respectful nod, but didn't break his stride. Near the smithy, the shouts of young boys playing in the drifts were muffled by the thickening air. The wind, a constant unseen presence, began to bite with a sharper edge, and still, she stood by her trunk, a lone figure in the swirling gray dot at last, a shape materialized from the curtain of white, a man whose broad frame seemed built to withstand the elements. A heavy coat was dusted with powder, and the brim of his hat cast his face in shadow. He moved with a heavy, deliberate tread, stopping a few feet from her. There was no warmth in his greeting, not even the courtesy of a smile. "Miss Mayhew," he stated, his voice flat, the sound swallowed by the vastness. He hefted her trunk onto the wagon bed with an air of impersonal duty, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. It was not until they reached the homestead, in the shelter of the barn where the wind could not pry, that he finally met her gaze. The words, when they came, were not cruel, but they struck with the force of a hammer blow. "This is not what I had envisioned," he said, his voice low. He paused, as if searching for a kinder way to deliver the verdict. "The letters, they don't say everything. I had pictured a woman of a more fragile build." Clara felt the air leave her lungs in a quiet rush. A knot of ice formed in her throat, making it impossible to speak. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of careful control, as if any larger movement might shatter the composure she was holding together with fraying thread. She offered no argument, no plea for reconsideration. Without another word, She turned her back on him and the life that had vanished before it ever began, her boots finding a slow rhythm in the deepening snow. Her feet carried her without direction, drawn back to the one landmark she knew in this desolate place. The platform was empty, the iron rails stretching into a white void. There was no wild sobbing, no outcry against the injustice of it all. Just a silent surrender as tears began to trace paths down her frozen cheeks, a quiet sorrow for a life that had lived and died in the space of a single afternoon. She had no ticket for a return journey, no acquaintance to call upon, no roof to shelter her from the encroaching night. She stayed until the deep, biting cold seeped into her bones, a lethargy that threatened to anchor her there for good. It was then that some resilient instinct, some deep-seated refusal to perish, stirred within her. To remain seated was a kind of ending, and she was not ready to end. With stiff, aching limbs, she rose. She grasped the cold leather handle of her trunk, turned away from the mocking emptiness of the tracks, and took her first step into the heart of Dry Creek, into the vast, unforgiving unknown. The town was little more than a main street carved from mud and flanked by false-fronted buildings that leaned against the wind. The faces of the few people she passed were etched with the hardness of the high plains, their eyes glancing at her with fleeting, unreadable curiosity. She moved among them like a phantom, her heavy trunk a testament to a journey that had ended. In failure, her damp shawl clinging to her shoulders dot at the edge of the thoroughfare. A faded sign advertised a room for let above the apothecary. It was a cramped attic space with a ceiling that slanted sharply and a single window that rattled with every gust. But the air was still, and it offered a reprieve from the snow. It was a shelter, for the price of what little remained of her. Sewing money, it was hers. There, in the quiet solitude of her small room, Clara began the painstaking work of reassembling a life from its scattered pieces. She did not ask for charity. Instead, she offered her skill. A notice pinned in the mercantile advertised her services. Torn seams mended, worn cuffs turned, patches applied with a neat, steady hand. She traded a finely baked apple pie at the town's small eatery for a measure of flour and a handful of eggs. Word of the mail order. Bride-sent packing traveled on the winter wind, of course. She felt the weight of curious stares and heard the hushed tones of pity that followed her down the street. But Clara met them all with an unbowed head and a straightness in her shoulders that gave nothing away. Each morning she would tie her apron, walk out into the cold, and show the town of Dry Creek that while a woman could be dismissed, she could never truly be discarded. In a town built by hardship, silent alliances were formed. The baker's wife would set aside a loaf that hadn't sold, accepting a neatly stitched potholder in return. The blacksmith's wife, a woman who understood the mending of strong things, once left a bundle of spare calico on her doorstep with a simple, knowing nod. It was a language of women, spoken without words, and through it, Clara began to feel the first threads of connection to this rugged place. But the place that began to thaw the frozen landscape of her heart was the town's mercantile. It was a nexus of commerce and conversation, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and licorice. Clara learned to time her visits for the mid-morning lull, after the ranchers had collected their supplies and before the household rush. When the air settled into a comfortable quiet dot, it was in that quiet space that she became aware of the man behind the long oak counter. His name was Eli Cartwright. He was a man of gentle height, with spectacles that seemed to magnify the thoughtfulness in his eyes. He wasn't a man of quick movements or loud pronouncements. There was a placid quality to him, a settled stillness that was as calming as a deep, clear pool. One morning, as she counted out coins for a spool of thread, his gaze fell upon the corner of a worn novel protruding from her basket. "A reader, I see," he remarked, his voice softer than the jangle of the bell above the door. Clara, startled from her thoughts, simply nodded. "They offer good company," she replied. a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "And these days I find myself in need of happy endings." A smile touched his lips, not of amusement, but of deep understanding. "I may have just the thing for that." The next time she came in, a slender volume, neatly wrapped in brown parcel paper, was sitting by the register. "For your consideration," Eli said, his eyes briefly meeting hers before looking down to polish the counter. "There is no cost. Only the promise that you'll bring it back when its story is told." She did, and upon its return, their conversation lingered. It started with the book's hero, then drifted naturally to the unpredictability of spring thaws, the secret to a flaky crust, and the way the color of the prairie changes with the light. Each visit added another layer to their talk, a slow and careful construction of shared thoughts. In all their exchanges, he never once alluded to the reason she was in Dry Creek. The town's gossip was a ghost that never crossed the threshold of his store. He saw her not as the subject of a sad tale, but as a person whose own story was still being written, and he seemed content to simply watch the pages turn. The slow melt of winter gave way to the soft mud of spring, and Clara found her path leading to the mercantile with a new regularity. Sometimes the pretense was a need for molasses, other times a skein of yarn, but the true purpose was the quiet comfort of the store and the man who inhabited it. He, in turn, began to anticipate her arrival. A book he thought she might favor would be resting on the counter, a silent invitation, and she noticed that he stood a little straighter whenever the bell above the door chimed her entrance. One morning, she arrived carrying not just her basket, but a small tart, its edges crimped with care, a simple ribbon tied around the tin. "Cranberry," she offered, placing it on the counter between them. He blinked, a look of sincere surprise on his face. "Miss Mayhew, this is far too generous." She met his gaze steadily. "Generosity isn't something to be tallied on a ledger, Mr. Cartwright. It's simply meant to be given." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time, she felt he was seeing past the chapters of her past and reading the very heart of her present story. Their conversations deepened after that, venturing into the quieter territories of their lives. He spoke of his late wife with a gentle sadness, and she, in turn, spoke of the Illinois home she sometimes missed in the twilight hours. One afternoon, as she turned to take her leave, his voice stopped her at the door. "Clara," he said, the sound quiet and sure. She paused, her hand on the latch. "The store. It's a brighter place when you are in it." She could only offer a small smile in return, but she carried the warmth of his words with her all the way. Back to her small room, holding them close like a hidden ember dot in the evenings. By the light of a single lamp, Clara undertook a private project. She unfolded the quilt that had traveled with her, a heavy map of her family's history. With the same patient hands that mended the town's worn garments, she began to add her own geography to it, a square from the faded blue of her own dress, a piece of gingham from the baker's wife, even a small strip of satin ribbon, the color of one he'd once said reminded him of a sunset. She was stitching her new life into the fabric of the old. When it was done, she wrapped it in brown paper and carried it to the store, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. "This is for you, Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she placed the package before him. He untied the twine and let the paper fall away. As the quilt unfolded, a landscape of color and memory spread across the counter. He didn't speak. Instead, his hand moved across the surface, his rough fingers tracing the lines between old worn cotton and new, bright calico. "You did this." He breathed, a statement of awe. "It was my mother's," she explained softly, "but I've added my story to it, to keep you warm." His eyes, when they finally lifted to meet hers, were full of a light she had never seen before. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "no one has ever gifted me their story." In that moment, The space between them, once a vast expanse of counter and caution, simply dissolved. Eli came around the oak barrier that had separated them for so long. He did not reach for her in haste. Instead, he took her hand in his calloused palm, a warm and steady anchor. His gaze held hers, clear and unwavering. "Clara," he said, his voice a low reverence, "in all my days I have never known a woman more beautiful." A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped her, not because the words were a shock, but because, for the first time, they felt like the simple, unvarnished truth. The annual town dance, held in the schoolhouse to celebrate the thaw, was a beacon of light and music against the darkening plains. Lanterns cast a golden glow on the bustling crowd, and the lively tune of a fiddle promised an evening of rare festivity. Clara came by herself, dressed in a simple gown the color of twilight, which she had sewn for an occasion she wasn't sure would ever arrive. She told herself she had come only for the spectacle, to watch from the sidelines and feel for a moment a part of the town's shared joy. But Eli had other intentions. From his post near the punch bowl, his eyes found her the instant she crossed the threshold, as if he had been waiting for her and her alone. He set his cup down and moved through the throng, not with apology, but with a quiet sense of purpose that parted the crowd before him. He stopped before her and offered a slight bow, a gesture of old-world courtesy. "Miss Mayhew," he asked, his voice clear above the chatter, "would you grant me the honor of this dance? Are you certain, Eli?" She whispered, aware of the sudden lull in conversation, of the eyes that turned their way. His smile was her answer. "I've never been more certain of anything." He led her to the center of the floor just as the fiddler began a slow, sweet waltz. He placed a hand gently on her waist, and as she rested hers on his shoulder, the rest of the world seemed to recede to a distant shore. Their steps were not flawless, but they moved as one, a quiet testament in the center of the room. And in that steady rhythm, the ghosts of the past, the frozen platform, the sting of rejection, the lonely nights finally, mercifully, faded into silence. Later, they stepped out into the cool, clean air, away from the warmth and the noise. The vast Wyoming sky was ablaze with stars. "I had thought my heart was a closed book," Eli confessed, his voice barely a murmur. "And then you walked into my store." Clara's throat tightened. "You were the first person here who didn't see a story someone else had told about me." He moved a step closer, his presence a solid warmth beside her. "That's because I was too busy reading the one you were writing yourself," he said. "And I have been, every day." When his lips met hers, there was no desperate haste. It was a kiss of arrival, a quiet, certain promise whispered in the starlight. "I have found you. I am home." A full turn of the seasons brought them to a summer's day so clear it felt like a benediction. On a gentle slope overlooking the vast sea of prairie grass, Clara stood beside Eli. She wore a simple dress of ivory cotton, the fine lacework at the collar and cuffs a testament to her own patient hands. The Wyoming breeze, now warm and smelling of sage and clover, played at the hem of her gown. His hands, she noted with a tender smile, trembled just slightly, but his gaze was unwavering. It was the look of a man who, after a long and weary journey, had finally reached his harbor, with the town of Dry Creek as their witness. They spoke their vows not with loud declaration, but with the quiet gravity of promises meant to last a lifetime. When Eli took her hand, he said, his voice husky, "The world was a silent place for a long time, Clara. You brought the music back into it." And her own hand, once chilled by loneliness, was now warm and certain in his. Later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and violet, they stood outside the mercantile where it had all begun. There was no music but the chirp of crickets and the soft rustle of the cottonwood leaves. "You gave me a new life," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. She smiled, a soft, knowing expression. "No, my dear Eli," she answered. You simply gave me the courage to live the one that was mine all along. And so the story of Clara Mayhew became woven into the fabric of Dry Creek, a tale whispered on the prairie winds. It's a story for anyone who has ever stood alone on a desolate platform, facing a future that has slammed a door in their face. It speaks a simple truth, that rejection is not a final judgment of your worth, and that the harshest winters can prepare the ground for the most unexpected spring. For Clara was never a delicate prairie flower meant to be sheltered. She was a sunflower, and she had been built all along to turn her own face toward the sun. A few autumns had passed since the day they stood on that hill. The Wyoming sky now held a deeper, more profound shade of blue, heralding the cool nights to come. Dusk was settling over the town of Dry Creek, painting the dusty roads in amber. Lamps began to glow in windows, and the scent of pine smoke from chimneys drifted on the air. On the porch of the Cartwright Mercantile, 2 wooden chairs had become a permanent fixture of the landscape. Eli sat in one, the day's ledger closed upon his lap. Beside him, Clara was mending a button on her husband's shirt, her fingers moving with a familiar and graceful ease. She was no longer the woman who used every stitch to bargain for her survival. Now she sewed out of love. Eli said nothing, simply watching her in the fading light. He saw the peace in her expression, the features that had been softened by contentment. And time. He looked at her hands, the same hands that had once mended the broken pieces of a life, now tending to their own. Clara felt his gaze without looking up. She smiled. "What is it, Eli?" He shook his head slightly, a warm smile touching his lips. "Nothing," he said softly. "Just taking stock of my blessings. They are not listed in this ledger." She looked up then, their eyes meeting in an understanding that needed no words. Just then, the blacksmith's wife passed by, nodding to them warmly. "Good evening, Cartwrights." "Good evening, ma'am," they replied in unison. They sat there in comfortable silence, listening as their town settled in for the night. They were no longer 2 separate stories that had collided in a snowstorm. They had become a single narrative, woven from the threads of patience, kindness, and understanding. Their life was a quiet hymn, a steady testament that even in the harshest soil, love could take root and flourish. For in the heart of Dry Creek, on the porch of a humble mercantile, they had built more than a life. They had built a world,